Hey guys, and welcome, and today's video is on water. And water is another one of those massive subjects that has so many moving parts to it, and I don't know whether you've gone researching water before, but I can tell you it's bloody confusing if you're out there trying to work out what the best type of water is, how water works, and all that sort of stuff. I've done 3,000 to 4,000 hours of research on water, and it's definitely not for the faint-hearted. Pretty humbling, but it's a really important component to getting the overall deal right. If you don't get the water right, it's like the light. If you don't get your water and your light right, getting those little micro changes into your diet, there's no point, or into your life as new habits. Then doing the macro stuff like diet, like exercise, and all that sort of stuff. You're not taking care of the foundational stuff. It's so important. Life is built when light gets slowed down by water. And there's those three organizing principles of life, light, magnetism, and water, and how they intersect is how life comes about. So, it is a massive subject. I'm going to talk a little bit about, to give you some sort of context, to give you an idea. They say we've got about 50 trillion cells in our body, and that's what that big number up on the top is. Our cells, each of those 50 trillion cells has about 20 trillion atoms and molecules. That means there's something like 1,000 trillion water molecules in your body. That's a lot. To give you some sort of idea, over 99.9% of all the number of molecules in your body are water molecules. So really, health when we arrive on this planet is about coherent water domains, and maybe the journey of life is about destruction of those coherent water domains and dehydration. Like I said, when we're born, we're about 90% water. When we depart, we're somewhere between 50 and 70% water. So staying hydrated's a really big deal. And when you think about that number of water molecules, it's absolutely mind-boggling and mind-bending about how dependent our entire being here is on water. So the most important water, and many of you are not going to know this, the most important water of all the water is the water that you make. So in our mitochondria, at an enzyme called fumarase, we make metabolic water as a process of reversing photosynthesis. So plants take photonic energy from the sun, water from the ground, and they produce sugar and oxygen. Sugars and oxygen. In our mitochondria, we reverse that process, and our exhaust products are water, and that's a very special kind of water, and carbon dioxide. So really what we're doing is reversing the photosynthetic process. It's a very special water because it has no contaminants in it. It is pure water. Now really there's nowhere else on the planet that makes that there's very few places in nature where water has no they're not contaminants, but things like minerals. This is a constituent-free water that's in our cells. And then we're designed to go out in the sun and have that water programmed by the different frequencies of light from the sun. So now you're probably starting to understand why it's so important that you get that natural light on your body and in your skin, because you're programming all those water cells inside your body. It's also why the artificial light's so cruddy for us. So that metabolic water, as I said, is made in the mitochondria, and it is super important that you get that right. Basically getting those little guys, the mitochondria, right, is the game of staying healthy. So when you go out there looking at water, every Tom, Dick and Harry tells you that their water is the best type of water. The number one thing that you need to look after when you're thinking about the water you consume is making sure that it's depleted of fluoride. So you're looking for unfluoridated water. Now, I've got a whole lot of different stuff up here. When we think of water, and I'll go back to what to do around water later on, but there's a couple of bits and pieces that I want to touch on. When we think of water, we think of this guy here, H2O. And H2O is just an average of, really, sort of an average. It's a bit like saying, well, it's grass. Well, there's different kinds of grass, there's different colours, there's different, water's a dynamic thing. And H2O doesn't describe really what's happening. These bonds between oxygen and hydrogen are always changing every femtosecond. Now, a femtosecond is a quadrillionth of a second. So that's, if I remember rightly, it's a billionth of a trillionth of a second. So those bonds are changing so quickly and dynamically. So when you look at a glass of water, there's a whole lot of stuff happening that you don't even see inside of it. You've got things like total dissolved solids in water, the pH of water, and most of us don't get that it's such a dynamic thing, and it's so easily influenced by very subtle energies, both good and bad. So, we've got things like H5O3, H9O4, it's not just H2O. And then you've got the full range of minerals and, depending on where the water is, what's in the water, every water source in the world's different. Now, for those that are, I'm going to touch on deuterium now just quickly. Deuterium is a hydrogen isotope that's in water, and deuterium is basically what helps our cells to get to a certain size so they can replicate themselves. Cells are just like us; they need to get to a certain size before they can replicate. That's why This D2O or deuterium water is used in growth, and it helps our brain to myelinate. But when we get to between 25 and 28, our brain fully myelinates or fully matures. And what that means is we no longer really have a use for deuterium. In fact, our existence is once we mature, is about depleting deuterium. So, and I'll get that more into that later, but not in this video. But depleting deuterium is the name of the game after you're 28, and that's one of the reasons why you can eat like a banshee when you're a kid. All sorts of crap. Why you can drink like a bloody lunatic in your late teens and early 20s and not suffer. But as you get into your 30s, or your late 20s, you start to suffer with headaches and hangovers, and you just can't cope like you used to. And one of the reasons for that is because you've got nowhere to put all this high deuterium intake, which is what you've been eating and drinking. So there is And deuterium has a role to play in metabolic function, cell structure, but it's when it's in the right place, it's okay. It's when it gets into the wrong places, it starts to cause a problem. And so that that process of deuterium in water happens because deuterium levels change in water depending on three components. Firstly, the altitude, the latitude, so where you are, the further closer you are to the poles, the less deuterium there is in the water. The closer you are to the equator, the more deuterium there is in the water. Now, and when you put all the bits together, what that means is, things like fruits are high in deuterium. And when you're healthy, it's not a problem because UV light pushes out deuterium. Getting cold pushes out deuterium. Fasting pushes out deuterium out of the body. And so all these things work together as part of that. But nobody in the water industry will ever speak to you about deuterium depletion or deuterium depleted water. Here in Australia, the levels are quite high in deuterium, and you can buy deuterium depleted water. Now, most people, unless you've got some sort of chronic disease, do not need to consider deuterium depleted water. I'll put it in the cheat sheet, a link to it with a discount code. But deuterium depleted water is mighty expensive because it's really expensive to produce. To give you an idea, seawater is about 155 parts per million. Hence, in Australia, of deuterium. In Australia, where we make a good percentage of our water from desalination plants, that means all our water is 155 parts per million. Tests that we've done across Australia, the best water came from Jenolan Caves in New South Wales. I think there's 147 parts per million. And the worst water was 161 parts per million. So unless you've got an issue, unless you've got some sort of disease or metabolic issue going on, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's cancer, whether it's Parkinson's, whether it's any one of those metabolic diseases, I'd consider deuterium depleted water. And there's a great book out there called Curing Cancer: The Biological Effects of Depleting Deuterium. So that's just a little side note. But let's get back to let's get back to this. So what is the best water? I get asked that all the time, and it's really a pretty loaded question. What is the best water? Fluoride free is the best deal. You've got spring water, filtered water. There's an ionized water called Kangen Water. I'm not a big fan of it. It does make molecular hydrogen, which I am a big fan of, but it does that on their filtration doesn't address fluoride. They do have some fluoride filters that they sell. Those filters have activated alumina in them. I would not drink water that's been past activated alumina, and they're pretty bloody useless at taking fluoride out of the water. So I'd stay away from that ionized water. The other reason I'd stay away from ionized water is because whilst it might drop the surface tension of the water. So what's surface tension? Surface tension is water molecules hang around in clusters, and when the energy falls out of the water, that cluster size gets bigger, so it's much harder for your body to use that water. When you energize the water, that cluster size gets smaller, so it's much easier for biological systems to use that type of water. But the Kangen water, yes, you might drop the surface tension like I mentioned, and you might increase the pH, and pH is another thing that people talk about. That's also it's probably the least most important part of creating great water. Yes, most people don't understand the difference between pH, alkaline, and alkalinity. Alkalinity is a liquid's ability to buffer acidity. Something can have a high alkaline or a high pH, but have very little alkalinity in it. And alkalinity is measured by the total dissolved solids in the water. That's why you can't drink and go on a water fast and drink alkaline water and stay alkaline, because the process of metabolism will level that out really quickly. And so, it's a nice point of differentiation, but it's not the be all and end all when it comes to water. Yeah, it can be a byproduct of making the water healthier. But again, on this electrically charged Kangen water or electrically ionized water, you have all these perceived benefits that marketers talk about, but it damages the actual crystalline structure of the water. And so, before I knew better, I've sold a ton of those machines. And I know for the last 5 years, I've not sold electric water ionizers. Vortex water. Nature's way of energizing everything is by vortex. So just think of your DNA, waves, cyclones, the Milky Way. It's all about the spin. When you accelerate the spin state of the water, there's so many different things happening all at once. You have temperature gradients, you have inertia gradients, you have gyroscopic, centripetal forces. You have a vortex acts like a grinder to grind up minerals in the water. In fact, when we put water through we have big units for agriculture. When we put water through that, the total dissolved solids often goes up because the action of the water's ground up more of those constituents in the water, so the TDS goes up. Vortexing water is really important because it energizes the water, so you don't need to drink as much of it. B, it energizes the water, so you don't need to drink as much of it, and it's more bioavailable. B, it rips apart toxins in the water. Not all, like the fluoride rate drops when we put it through our vortex devices without filtration, and that's the reason why I've got this little pyramid here. There's really 3 steps to creating great water from tap water. One's to remove the contaminants, obviously get the fluoride out. If you haven't got a decent fluoride filter, talk to me. Next is vortexing the water, so restoring that natural structure to the water. And then thirdly, enhancing it. The same way you can contaminate water. They say in the US there's something like 97,000 contaminants at least in water. The same way you can contaminate water, you can enhance water. I think the EPA and here in Australia, we test for less than 100 contaminants in water. So, they get the water samples and they test for things like drugs, the pill, the list goes on and on when they bother checking for it. But those things are in the water we drink. So cleaning up your water is super important. Reverse osmosis systems and distilled water reverse osmosis is a great way to clean the water, but you've got to make sure that you put the minerals back in it, because as I mentioned earlier, it makes the water really, really aggressive. And so that water will pull because it's looking for, it takes the minerals out, and depending on where you live in the water that you're putting into it will depend on how much is left in the water. Where there's a lot of solids in the water, like here in Perth, you don't have to worry about that too much. But there's a lot of different things that you, like in Melbourne, you definitely need to remineralise the water, and it's just a good thing to do. Distilled water, again, very aggressive. And the thing with that is bond angles matter. So when the bond angles wider apart, and that's another thing that changes inside a vortex, when the bond angles wider apart, the body's ability to use it is much better. Now when you distill water, that bond angle on average is usually at 104.5 degrees. When you distill water, that drops down to about 101, and it makes the water really unbioavailable. I would really encourage you to stay away from distilled water, and that includes brands like Pura Water, that some of the guys have asked me about before I shot this. Any of that sort of water, you must put some Celtic sea salt or some